Good morning. I'm Peter Barker. I'm Professor of the History of Science at the University of Oklahoma, and I've been asked by Professor Hoodboy to introduce you to an important historical character, Galileo Galilei, who I hope you're shortly going to be able to meet in the flesh. Well, in the digital flesh, at least. So here's Galileo at about the age he'll be when you meet him. He was born in the city of Florence in central Italy in 1564. To give you some reference points, that's the same year that William Shakespeare was born in England, and in your part of the world, it's the middle of the reign of Akbar I, the famous Mughal ruler, sometimes called Akbar the Great. To understand Galileo's story, you need to understand a minimum amount about the history of Europe, particularly the history of Italy, at the time he was alive, especially the status of the Catholic Church and what was going on with the new science. The most important thing to understand is that, as far as science is concerned, the Catholic Church had committed itself to the views of a single important Greek philosopher, Aristotle, who was supposed to have supplied the essential truth about all matters cosmological. Aristotle believed that the Earth was stationary and in the center of the cosmos, that everything else, including much larger objects like the sun, went around the Earth. Now, this wasn't just a foolish idea, it wasn't a whim. There were very good arguments in favor of it. Aristotle actively considered and refuted the possibility that the Earth might be a planet. Nevertheless, this was unfortunate as far as the progress of astronomy was concerned, and it wasn't until nearly 1500 years after the time of Aristotle, who died in 322 BC, that Nicholas Copernicus published a book in which he proposed, on the basis of an extensive mathematical analysis, that the Earth was a planet that went around the sun. Copernicus's book was published in 1543, 20 years before Galileo was born. It didn't immediately provoke reaction from the Church, contrary to modern myth. At the time, Copernicus's ideas were regarded as so mathematical that they were to be considered the special province of mathematicians and really nobody else. And as a further indication of the uncontroversial nature of at least astronomy, Copernicus actually dedicated the book to the then Pope. Now, as you'll be aware, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, and several popes will figure importantly in Galileo's story. For our purposes, then, the thing to understand about Copernicus's new proposal that the Earth was a planet was that it attracted very, very few adherents between the time of Copernicus's death, which was also 1543, and the time that Galileo began serious telescopic observations of the heavens in 1610. Arguably, less than a dozen people in the entire world accepted Copernicus's views as physically real. At the same time, the Church itself was having difficulties. These had started during Copernicus's lifetime, with Martin Luther starting a movement initially for church reform, but latterly becoming a new church completely independent from the Catholic Church, which we now know as the Lutheran Church, or more generally as the movement known as Protestantism. Throughout the century leading up to Galileo's scientific work then, the Catholic Church was busy defending itself against the expansion of the new religion and trying, where possible, to re-establish itself as the sole authority in all spiritual matters for Christians. So Galileo became a member of one of these movements, but not the other. He remained a devout Catholic throughout his entire life, but he became one of the strongest defenders of the new theory of Copernicus. So, now to the Galileo story in thumbnail. Despite being connected with the court of the Duke of Tuscany, Galileo spent the first half of his life as a university professor teaching in various other places in Italy, notably the University of Pisa and the University of Padua, which was controlled by the merchant city of Venice. It was there in 1609 that he heard about a new discovery or invention being sold by people from Holland. It was what they called a spyglass. and it was a simple and not very powerful telescope. It probably magnified by no more than 2 or 3. Galileo probably didn't actually see one of these objects himself, but he understood the principle well enough that he could go home and re-engineer the technology. He devised not the telescope then, but a new type of telescope. The original telescope had biconvex lenses. Galileo used a biconcave lens as the large front lens of the telescope. This had a number of useful consequences. For example, it made the image that you were seeing upright. Galileo began to produce his own lenses as well, which meant that his telescopes rapidly increased in power. Now, he originally thought of these probably as having terrestrial applications. They had obvious applications in military affairs and in business. But sometime in 1609, he seems to have, for the first time, turned his telescope to the sky. And when he did that, he discovered an absolute deluge of new phenomena, most of which seemed to contradict Aristotle and support Copernicus. Galileo saw this as an immediate opportunity, not an opportunity to become scientifically famous, although that was part of it, but rather an opportunity to get the job he'd always wanted as a courtier of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So in 1610, he published a very rapidly produced book in which he described the construction of his telescope and his first telescopic discoveries. You're going to have the opportunity to talk to Galileo while he's actually making these discoveries, so I won't tell you too much more about those. Suffice to say that Galileo was successful in his new job campaign. The Duke gave him a position as a courtier, continued to support his research, and Galileo became actually rather famous all over Italy. Now, fame, of course, has its drawbacks. It attracts envy. And the people who were most envious of Galileo seem to have been members of the Catholic Church who were hoping to receive the resources that Galileo was now receiving from the same source, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So in 1613 and 14, various church members began to complain that Galileo's support for the Copernican doctrine contradicted the Bible and church teaching. Galileo at this point was a senior courtier for one of the most powerful noblemen in Italy, and you don't easily attack someone. So despite the fact that by 1616 Galileo's detractors were able to insist that the Copernican doctrine be officially examined by the Inquisition, Galileo himself wasn't harmed by this. Although the Copernican doctrine was declared in parts heretical and in parts erroneous in faith, Galileo himself and his writings were neither censured nor condemned. Indeed, the Copernican writings weren't condemned. Although some church members who'd written about Copernicus had their books banned, Copernicus's book wasn't banned, but rather prohibited until corrected, and members of the church were given a list of offensive passages which they were supposed to replace with acceptable wording. Galileo was so far from being in danger in 1616 that immediately after the condemnation of Copernicus, he was actually granted an audience with the Pope, and then returned safely to the court of the Duke of Tuscany, where he continued to do research, engage in scientific controversy, until nearly 10 years later, something very fortunate, seemingly, happened. One of the cardinals who had defended Galileo in Rome in 1616 himself became Pope. Galileo immediately went back to Rome, had a series of audiences with the new Pope, and asked for permission to write a book comparing Aristotle with Copernicus. He received permission from the Pope, subject to the simple prohibition that he discuss Copernicanism only hypothetically. He was also required to obtain the usual set of licenses for publishing a book from the church authorities. This he did. The book was produced in 1632, and immediately there were problems. Here things get very complicated. It's true that Galileo was called back to Rome and ultimately condemned, not as a heretic, but for being vehemently suspected of heresy, largely because of things he'd said in this book. But there are many complicating factors, including the political situation in the church, the political situation of the Pope himself, and the fact that Galileo had rather foolishly placed a direct quotation from the Pope in the mouth of one of the characters in the book, a character called Simplicius, Mr. Simple, whose ideas, oddly enough, end up being wrong. So, in 1633, Galileo was made to formally abjure, give up Copernicanism. And the Pope was clearly very angry about the whole thing. Galileo was confined to house arrest in his villa outside Florence for the rest of his life. The condemnation of Galileo turned into a public relations disaster for the Church, one from which, frankly, it's still recovering. This is a much later imagining of what it looked like when Galileo appeared before the Inquisition. It's wildly inaccurate historically. Notice that the figure of Galileo has dark hair and a dark beard. He's a young man. When Galileo actually appeared before the Inquisition, he was between 69 and 70 years old, infirm and probably confined to a chair for most of the proceedings. However, most of the interrogation would have been handled by just 3 people, so that part of the picture is perhaps accurate. Now, I shouldn't be too unkind about this illustration because when you see the equivalent part of the Galileo game, you'll find that our figure of Galileo hasn't been aged appropriately either. So, if you want, you can find out what the Inquisition said in their verdict at Galileo's trial, and you can find out exactly what Galileo had to say when he was forced to abjure. But frankly, this is not one of the best developed aspects of the game right now. The Galileo game at present concentrates on how all this began, with Galileo's work in Venice, first constructing telescopes and then applying them in a completely new way to observe the sky. And when you play the game, you'll be able to assist in doing that. You'll also be able to make a brief visit to Aristotle and find out more about the cosmology that Copernicus and Galileo were objecting to. Venice was an island city on the Adriatic, on the northeast coast of Italy. In the center of the city, during Galileo's time and also today, you'll find St. Mark's Square. At one end of the square, seen here in the center of the picture, you'll find the spiritual heart of the city, St. Mark's Cathedral, with its spectacular domes. Opposite the cathedral is a tall tower known as the Campanile or Bell Tower. Galileo used this tower both to make observations and to demonstrate his telescope. When you visit him, you'll probably find him in St. Mark's Square, and you'll probably be invited to join him in the Bell Tower. So, what conclusions can we draw from Galileo's life and experiences? Well, he didn't prove Copernicus was right. He certainly provided a lot of evidence that supported that general idea and that suggested that Aristotle was wrong about a number of specific things. But nobody before Isaac Newton actually had a principled reason for insisting that the Earth goes round the Sun. Perhaps you can get Professor Hoodboy to explain how the law of universal gravitation, together with the second law of motion, guarantees that the Earth has to be a planet. However, the most important thing that people remember when it comes to Galileo is his dealings with the Church. Does the Galileo affair show that science and religion are natural enemies? Probably not. As I've emphasized, a lot of additional factors were required to make religion confront science in the way that it did during the Galileo affair. If the Church hadn't, for example, been challenged by the Protestants at the same time, things might have gone very differently. Galileo himself certainly didn't believe that science and religion were incompatible. He remained throughout his life a devout Catholic who thought that his religion supported his science. However, if we are to draw a moral from what happened to him, it would probably be that at least some of the time the theologians need to listen to the scientists. So, thanks for listening to me, and I hope to have the opportunity to answer your questions.